Accommodating others, the artist as medium. This section regards the role of the artist through the metaphor of a medium. The analogy has been drawn in a myriad ways by artists and critics for reasons not dissimilar to those that give the spiritual medium her title. The medium is the channel, substance, or field through which a spirit manifests itself before the living. Notably more often female than not, she finds herself in between, the middle, medium, of input and output, and makes an instrument of herself. Whether interpreter, go-between, or one possessed, the nature of her occupation has a peculiar consequence for the flavour of her personhood. So as you can see, we're preparing to talk about what happens if you imagine that the artist is not so much the origin of where the ideas come from in the artwork, but more of a kind of medium, a channel through which something outside, external to the artist, is filtering through the artist and coming out in the artwork. And this artwork here, actually, this is a still from a video that I made in 2018, and the video performance work is called Pseudo. And this is probably of my works the one that exemplifies most this idea of the artist becoming a sort of instrument or tool for something else to come and take over. And as the introduction to this section has already stated, the spiritual medium, the medium that contacts ghosts and channels spirits, we can think of this character as an analogy for what an artist does in this section. And where we left off in the reading here is kind of interesting. Whether interpreter, go-between, or one possessed, the nature of the medium's occupation has a peculiar consequence for the flavour of her personhood. So what happens to a medium's sense of self when they are, in a way, their identity is all wrapped up in the idea of channeling the identity of others? So we're going to look at that now. In her pop cultural appearances, the medium's personal conscience is rarely seen to intervene in the séance. She serves, irrespective of motives. While the preparatory meditative trance and closed, humming eyes attest to great concentration and a collected mind, the twitches and shudders which eventually follow, and the fits and cries after that, become the mark of a usurped will, of someone overcome. She has made her own person recede, accommodating a ghostly other in its wake. Like meditation, and perhaps like art, this achievement seems to come easily by accident and laboriously by design. But underneath the grip of horror conjured by the main event, this bursting presence of a silenced someone, other things might go through our minds as we watch what takes place. We might pity the medium for the torturous nature of her calling, a calling, not a choice. We might become anxious about the scarcity of soul space within her body and the economy of consciousness that demands. Because if you've seen movies with mediums in them, you'll often notice that when the medium is possessed by the spirit, it's as if the medium isn't there anymore. Where has she gone? She's been kind of occupied by this other presence. So it's almost as if the body can only accommodate one agent at a time, and you have to kind of disappear yourself as a medium to allow something else in. So that's what I mean by scarcity of soul space. There's a fighting of agencies happening sometimes in these scenes. In either case, we are led to wonder at the passive nature of the role. She may be a person who does everyday things and has everyday thoughts, but as a continual conduit of others' stories, her individuality and the sanctity of her interior life is compromised by the external spirits overpopulating and saturating it. On screen, This bombardment is often represented by the schizophrenic burden of hearing voices. And I have in the footnotes some examples of mediums on screen. With experience, and as the role takes hold of her identity, it becomes paradoxical to ask who the medium is, because her very role is defined by the practice of dimming down her own inner light. Why mediums tend to be female in the historical representation of mediums and in culture and television and so on is itself quite interesting, and maybe you can speculate yourself on why that might be the case, but I'll leave that to you for now. Within the context of art, the term medium is typically associated with an artist's material means of production, whether paint, clay, or movement. However, rather than being external perusers of these materials, some artists have conceived of their person as a medium, part of the art-making apparatus. The analogy of a medium casts the authority of the author, the artist, as a passive form of power that authorizes a relinquishment of the self in order to make space for someone or something else. So here I'm just pointing out that adopting the view of the artist as a kind of medium or a channel is kind of strange when we think about authorship. We tend to think of authorship as a kind of godlike position. You know, if I write a book, for example, I can make anything I want happen in this book. I'm sort of the god of the book world. But if we think of the author as a channel or a medium, the author is no longer the kind of originator of the intentionality of the work, or the ideas in the work, or the decisions in the work to some extent. It seems to be coming from somewhere else. So there's a strange sort of notion that an artist is in control of making whatever they're making, but oddly, if they're conceived as a medium, it's a passive kind of power. Rather than imposing their own expression in the work, they're kind of letting something happen through them. And what you're authorizing, what you're allowing to happen, is a sort of letting go of the self, a stepping back of your own will, in a way, to make space for someone or something else. The metaphor of the medium invites us to consider the artist as someone who facilitates the playing out of an other's voice. By rendering the self as a kind of instrument, this perspective on authorship begets a line of questioning about creative processes and the mechanics of agency. Can a person become a medium for another agent? Does this practice require a preliminary act of making space for the other? And to what extent is this space also shared or occupied by the author? Is it a joint occupancy or a swap? And why is this spatial conceptualization of selfhood so pervasive in our psychic imagining of agency? Is it illuminating or misleading? By spatial conceptualization, I mean, and we'll get into that a lot more later, but for example, this intuition that we see depicted in movies, that the medium has a kind of limited capacity for how many agents she can host. So it's either going to be her in her usual personality, or it's going to be the spirit that takes over. So we have almost this idea of the body as a vessel, as a space that can be then filled up with a spirit that's either hers or the spirit visitor. So is this kind of intuition about the person being kind of vessel-like and having a certain amount of space for a certain number of occupants, is that illuminating or is that misleading? Are we imagining that wrong? So here I'm getting a little bit interested in almost the physics of agency, or what we imagine to be the physics of agency. And it's funny because, you know, we are opening up with really just talking about making art and how can we conceptualize what the artist is doing when they're making art. And yet it's kind of necessitating us to think about what a person is in the same breath. So this is something that keeps happening throughout this section. We talk about what an artist is doing, but it's hard not to talk about what a person is as we talk about what an artist is doing. Okay, so those are some ideas, and we're going to continue this line of thought. So, the distinction between an active versus passive conception of the artist's role in creativity recalls familiar 20th century debates about originality and authorship. Debates which will probably continue so long as active and passive modes of authorship are believed to be mutually exclusive. That point is a little bit nuanced, and I'm not going to open up into it too much at present. But when I'm talking about active and passive conceptions of the artist's role, think about the question, where is the creativity coming from? When you look at a painting by Van Gogh or whoever, where did those ideas and the kind of the spirit of the work that you're looking at, where did that come from? Did it come from Van Gogh? Was it something inside him that he let out and now it's on the painting? Is it something that projected out of Van Gogh onto the painting? Which we could say is like a sort of active conception of the artist's role, that Van Gogh willed something from within himself and it's now on the painting. Or, you know, we're starting to maybe take on a different idea, thinking of the artist as a kind of channel, in which case where the creativity, where the ideas, where the spirit of the artwork is coming from might be from some other source, and the artist is just one stop along the way to the artwork. So the next line of questioning, the next few things we are going to talk about now have to do with this question, where does the art come from? The distinction between an active versus passive conception of the artist's role in creativity recalls familiar 20th century debates about originality and authorship. Debates which will probably continue so long as active and passive modes of authorship are believed to be mutually exclusive. So there I'm hinting a little bit at the idea, need we necessarily think of these things as opposite? Is it really a case of either or, that it's either coming from Van Gogh, this painting, or it's coming from somewhere else and it's just being channeled through him? Or is there another way entirely to think about what's happening in the creative act and how it's coming together, where we don't need to even make a distinction between the artwork coming from Van Gogh and coming from outside? What if Van Gogh is in some way the same thing as the agency that is outside himself? What if there's more to Van Gogh? What if the world is attached to Van Gogh in a significant way, in a way in which the world and Van Gogh are actually one? That's getting a little bit more nuanced, so we'll get to that. For now, let's think about active versus passive conceptions of the artist's role in creativity. We see this active versus passive conception of agency somewhere else, and we see it in grammar. If I say, Katarina is drinking the coffee, Katarina is the active subject in that sentence, and coffee is passive, is the object. Something is happening to the coffee, so the coffee is the object, and I'm the subject, I'm the agent that's doing something to the coffee. That's why I'm talking about grammar next. So it says, just as in the case of grammar, with its active subjects and passive objects, at the heart of this distinction is the question of who drives the intentionality behind an artwork's apparently singular voice. Encompassing this question is a larger one that asks who drives the intentionality behind our own selves, since both artworks and personal artifacts, such as voice, stimulate in their recipients the search for an originating agent upon which to pin responsibility, property, and belonging. Once again, here I'm making that point that when we think about artistic authorship, we almost immediately get wrapped up in thinking about what a person is and how we can conceive of a person's agency. Again, in the Van Gogh example, what this is saying is, when you look at the painting, if you're asking questions about authorship, you would be asking who is driving the intentionality behind this artwork. Is it Van Gogh? Is it something external to him or something else? But similarly, when you see me sitting here talking to you, waving my hands about, speaking, you are seeing behaviors, you're seeing speech, gestures, you're getting messages from what I'm saying. And from what you're seeing, you are probably imagining that there's something called Katarina that's willing these gestures to happen. You're searching for some kind of originating source as the one who is responsible for saying these things, waving these things, and that source you call Katarina. So when we ask questions about how did this painting get here, how was it made, who intended it, we're asking questions of authorship. But even when you're communicating with somebody in everyday life, you have this kind of theory of mind that what they're doing and they're saying is coming from some kind of intentional source. And this is the sort of thing we're opening up to question in this text. So let's move along. Without directly engaging in that debate, in this active versus passive authorship debate, or explicitly endorsing the author's role as medium, this section will simply attempt to appreciate a series of enduring historical accounts that in some way attest to the need to disappear the self in a creative act in order to make room for something altogether other. This discussion will then allow me to speculate on the spatial conceptualizations that attend the notion of making room, and to consider the self as a spatial entity that requires room in which to operate.